Hello and welcome to the Sacred Truth channel. Today we are not simply facing another common biblical topic, nor a light reflection on spirituality, but an idea that directly touches the way life holds itself together when everything around begins to fall apart. Because when we talk about four biblical businesses that never fail in times of crisis, we are not talking about business in the modern sense. We are not talking about financial strategies or human entrepreneurial ideas. We are talking about spiritual principles that function as invisible foundations of existence, deep realities that cross generations, cultures, and crises without losing their strength. And perhaps the real question here is not just what these businesses are, but what makes some people remain standing even when everything around them collapses, while others completely lose direction at the first impact of crisis. And before we continue, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel right now and turn on the notification bell, because here at Sacred Truth we do not treat the Bible as something distant or merely historical. We treat it as a set of living principles that continue to manifest in real life, in human decisions, in the deepest emotions, and even in moments of greatest uncertainty. And as you watch this video, I want you not just to listen, but to observe carefully. Because often what we call crisis is not only what happens around us, it is also what reveals within us what was built long before the crisis arrived. And that is exactly why this topic is not just informative. It is revealing. Now, the first of these biblical businesses that never fail in times of crisis is the business of unshakable faith in God, not as a passing emotion, not as a convenient religious idea, but as a deep structure of trust that sustains life even when there is no immediate explanation for what is happening. Because faith in its biblical essence was never designed to exist only in moments of comfort or stability. It has always been presented as something that is truly revealed in the middle of uncertainty, in the silence, in the waiting, and in everything that cannot be controlled. And that is exactly where most people are tested, not when everything is going well, but when everything begins to lose meaning, when everything is stable, when there are resources, when there are answers, when there are open paths. Faith seems natural, almost automatic, almost easy to maintain. But it is precisely in that state that it often has not yet been proven. Because it is not abundance that reveals the depth of faith. It is the absence of guarantees. It is when answers are delayed, when silence extends, when doors seem closed, and when human logic can no longer provide sufficient explanations, that faith stops being just a speech and becomes a structure. And at that point, two people can be going through exactly the same crisis, but react in completely different ways. One collapses internally because they depend entirely on what they see, what they feel, and what they can control, while the other remains relatively firm because they have built something inside themselves that does not depend on the external environment to stand. And that is why this first business never goes bankrupt. Because it does not depend on external stability. It does not depend on human approval. It does not depend on favorable circumstances. It does not depend on immediate results. It depends on a continuous internal decision to remain connected, even when there are no visible signs, even when there are no clear answers, even when everything seems to suggest the opposite. And this creates something that the world cannot easily produce: inner stability in the middle of external chaos. And when we understand this, we begin to see that faith is not just a religious concept. It is an existential foundation. It does not eliminate crisis, but it redefines the person's position within the crisis. It does not necessarily change the immediate scenario, but it changes the way that scenario is faced. And that is exactly why this first principle is already, by itself, a business that never fails. because it does not depend on the world, functioning correctly in order to keep functioning within the human being. And now the second biblical business that also never fails in times of crisis is something that is often underestimated, but which the Bible treats as extremely valuable. The business of divine wisdom applied to practical life. And here we need to understand that wisdom, in the biblical perspective, is not just accumulated knowledge, not just information, nor human intelligence. Wisdom is the ability to make the right decisions at the right time, especially when everything around is confused, pressured, and emotionally unstable. Because in a crisis, the greatest danger is not always the crisis itself. Often it is the way people respond to it. When fear enters, when anxiety dominates, when pressure increases, when uncertainty grows, it is very common for decisions to be made in a rushed, emotional, or impulsive way. And these are exactly the decisions that often amplify the problem instead of solving it. Biblical wisdom, however, works like a kind of mental and spiritual stability that prevents external chaos from completely dominating internal choices. It does not eliminate the crisis, but it prevents the crisis from destroying the future through wrong decisions made in the present. And that is why wise people can, even in unstable environments, reorganize, rebuild, and move forward, while others, even with fewer external losses, end up sinking further because of their own choices. Because the difference is not only in the situation, it is in the way the situation is interpreted and handled. And this shows something very deep. Wisdom is not a luxury. It is survival. And in an unstable world, this becomes even more evident. And perhaps here lies one of the greatest truths of this second principle. Biblical wisdom does not depend on external conditions to function. It depends on internal alignment with correct principles. And when that happens, even in the middle of chaos, there is direction, there is discernment, and there is the ability to keep walking without completely losing the way. Now that we have already understood the first two principles, unshakable faith and divine wisdom, applied to practical life, we begin to notice a very clear pattern. We are not talking about isolated ideas, but about internal structures that sustain human life when everything around begins to lose stability. And this is important because in a real crisis, people are not destroyed only by what happens outside of them, but mainly by the absence of internal foundations that can sustain decisions, emotions, and perceptions under pressure. And that is exactly why the next two biblical businesses continue the same line of thought, but now deepen even further the way God establishes principles that do not collapse with the world. The third biblical business that never fails in times of crisis is the business of obedience, even without full understanding. Or in other words, the ability to follow divine direction even when human logic cannot yet fully understand why. And this at first glance seems simple to say, but extremely difficult to live, because human nature has been conditioned to want explanations before action, understanding before decision, and clarity before movement. However, in biblical dynamics, many of the greatest transformations did not happen because everything was clear, but precisely because someone chose to obey even without having full clarity. And here there is a very deep clash between two ways of living: a life guided only by human understanding, and a life guided by a trust that goes beyond immediate comprehension. Because when someone depends exclusively on total understanding to act, that person inevitably becomes paralyzed in many moments of life, especially in times of crisis, where clarity is generally scarce and pressure is high. But when there is a willingness to obey even without understanding everything, that person can continue moving forward, even in environments of uncertainty. And this does not mean absence of reasoning. It does not mean intellectual blindness, It simply means recognizing that not every direction needs to be fully understood at the beginning in order to be correctly followed. And here is where this principle becomes extremely powerful, because it breaks the idea that total control is necessary for progress. In fact, it shows the opposite. Often, progress begins precisely when the need for absolute control is abandoned. And this creates a different kind of stability, because the person stops depending on perfect clarity to keep walking and starts depending on progressive trust, where understanding comes along the way, not necessarily before it. And in times of crisis, this becomes vital, because crisis almost never offers ideal conditions for fully clear decisions. It demands movement even in the midst of uncertainty. And the third and final, biblical business, which completes this structure and reveals the deepest foundation of all, is the business of spiritual and emotional perseverance in long processes of waiting, silence, and apparent absence of response. Because one of the greatest difficulties of human experience is not only facing sudden crises, but dealing with processes that take time, situations that are not resolved quickly, and moments when the dominant feeling is that nothing is happening, even when internally everything is being shaped. And it is exactly in this type of scenario that many people lose strength, not because they have lost initial faith, but because they have not been able to sustain the continuity of the journey. Biblical perseverance is not just passive resistance. It is active continuity, even when there are no immediate signs of change. It is staying aligned even when time seems to be against you. It is remaining firm even when results have not yet appeared. It is maintaining consistency even when emotion begins to weaken. And this is extremely important, because many things in life fail not because of a lack of beginning, but because of a lack of continuity. Many people start well. They start with faith. They start with enthusiasm. They start with direction. But they give up in the middle of the process, because the time between the promise and the result was longer than their emotional capacity to wait. And that is why this fourth principle closes the cycle in such a profound way, because it shows that it is not enough to start well. It is not enough to have faith at the beginning. It is not enough to make wise decisions. And it is not even enough to obey at the start. It is necessary to sustain all of this over time, especially when nothing seems to be changing. And this completely transforms the way we understand crisis, because crisis stops being just a momentary event and becomes also a process of internal maturation, where what remains is more important than what begins. And this is exactly where we arrive at the point where everything starts to make sense, because these four biblical businesses are not just survival strategies. They are structures of permanence. They were not created to avoid crisis, but to go through crisis without losing identity, direction, and foundation. And when this is understood, the way we see life changes completely. And now, after we have gone through these four principles, unshakable faith in God, divine wisdom applied to practical life, obedience even without full understanding, and perseverance in long processes, we begin to notice something that goes far beyond a simple list of spiritual ideas. We begin to see an invisible pattern that sustains the entire biblical narrative and, in a way, also sustains the human experience in times of crisis. Because when everything is reduced to the essential, when all external layers are removed, when distractions disappear, and life is placed under real pressure, what remains is not what seemed strongest, but what had true foundation. And that is exactly what these four biblical businesses reveal. They are not temporary solutions to momentary problems. They are permanent structures for spiritual and emotional survival in any life scenario. And perhaps here lies one of the greatest truths that many only realize too late. Crises do not create weaknesses. Crises only reveal weaknesses that were already hidden. In the same way, crises do not create strength. They only reveal what has already been built in silence over time. And that is why some people collapse when everything changes around them, while others manage to remain firm, even without having control over anything. Not because they are superior, not because they are immune to pain, but because they have built foundations that do not depend on external circumstances to keep them standing. When we look at faith, we see that it is not just a belief, but an anchor. When we look at wisdom, we see that it is not just knowledge, but direction in the midst of chaos. When we look at obedience, we see that it is not just blind submission, but reliable movement even without full visibility. And when we look at perseverance, we see that it is not just resistance, but conscious continuity when everything inside and outside seems to suggest stopping or giving up. And when these four things come together, the result is not just survival. It is inner stability in the midst of external instability. And this brings us to an inevitable reflection. Perhaps the greatest problem for many people is not the crisis they face, but the absence of these foundations being cultivated before the crisis arrives. Because no one builds strength in the middle of collapse. Strength is built in the invisible, in silence, in daily consistency, in small decisions that seem irrelevant at the moment, but become vital when the scenario changes. And that is why this kind of message is not just meant to inform, it is meant to awaken. Now I want to leave you with a very direct question, and I really want you to think honestly before answering. Among these four principles, which one do you feel is most missing in your life today? Is your faith firm, or does it fluctuate when things do not happen in the time you expect? Has your wisdom been guiding your decisions, or has fear been speaking louder? Are you able to obey even when you do not understand everything, or do you need total control to move forward? And have you been able to persevere, or have you stopped in the middle of the journey when the process becomes too long? Write it in the comments, because your answer may not just be a reflection. It may be the beginning of real change. And if this video spoke to you in any way, I want to invite you to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Because in the end, these biblical businesses are not just ideas to be admired. They are foundations to be lived. And the difference between those who remain and those who fall is often not in the crisis itself, but in what was built before it arrived. And with this, we conclude this reflection, but we do not conclude the conversation, because what you do with this message from this moment on is what will truly determine whether it remains just a video you watched or a principle that begins to transform the way you live.